Hi, Dr. Joe. My name is Tanner Blackwell. I am a student in your Marine Science 210 course, spring 2025, and I want to tell you about my perspective on chasing coral. First impressions, just face value. I absolutely love the documentary. I've always been a fan of documentaries, especially nature documentaries, and just some of the visuals that were in this documentary of the ocean, especially in the beginning, were just gorgeous and beautiful. And after watching this documentary, I definitely have a new perspective on our oceans. Emotionally, I'll get into it later, but I felt a little sad near the end. Just what's going on with the bleaching and global warming and everything. But so for a brief overview of the documentary, it started off with this guy used to be an ad man, and he always loved the ocean. And one day he went out to the Florida Keys, and this was one of the first scenes of the documentary. He saw a huge bed of elkhorn, and it was all dead. And he talked to a marine biologist, and he kind of told him what was going on. All the elkhorn in the Florida Keys was reduced to around 0.09% because of coral bleaching. And in Florida alone, they have already lost 89 to 90% of the corals in Florida. And in the last 50 years, we've lost around 50% of the world's corals. But one of the first things that I found interesting that I can also relate to this class that we learned was kind of the anatomy of coral and how it works. Basically, coral is made up of thousands of polyps, and each polyp is kind of like its own living organism, all with mouths. And what these polyps do is they photosynthesize and they create food for themselves, essentially fueling the coral. So each coral has thousands to millions of these little, powerhouses that are just, allowing the coral to grow and expand and live. So that was one thing that, I kind of remembered from this course. But the documentary went on, and it changed to this guy who was absolutely obsessed with coral, and he loved studying it. He loved to scuba dive and take pictures of coral. And they ended up they went to a place called Airport Reef because they heard that all the coral was turning white, and they kind of wanted to see what was going on. And they discovered that it was coral bleaching, and they kind of found after experimenting that just 1 or 2 degrees hotter, like if the water were to turn 1 to 2 degrees, then that could be detrimental to the coral. And the way they compared it was a human body. If your regulation temperature in a human body is 96 degrees, and you were to increase it like 1 or 2 degrees, that doesn't seem like much, but overall, if you're walking around just with a 99, 98 degree internal body temperature, that might not be a good thing. But this scientist, or this guy who was obsessed with coral, wanted to figure out a way to spread awareness. And so he had an idea to make a time lapse of some corals in the Great Barrier Reef and kind of, spread awareness about that and show what happens to coral in like a 4-month span. And so at first they went to 3 different locations and tried out 3 different cameras. And 4 months later, they found that all 3 of the cameras were unfocused and none of the footage was good. And so his name was Zach. Zach's second idea was to go to the Great Barrier Reef and manually take pictures of each and every coral. And while they were at this Great Barrier Reef, another thing I can connect to the class and what we've learned is adaptation and how plants and animals can adapt to their own environments. And something that happened that they saw while on this trip was the coral started to become fluorescent. And this was essentially the coral producing its own sunscreen for the heat and to protect itself from the heat. But its protection didn't really end up working, and the coral ends up dying anyway. And so that's kind of something that, I took from this class. And that I saw in the documentary. But so just a couple facts that I also thought were cool, or not cool, but just interesting. So the ocean absorbs most of the heat, and if the heat that comes off from producing CO2, and if the ocean didn't do its job by absorbing this heat, the average temperature of planet Earth would be around 122 degrees. And Hawaii, also, while these photographers were on their trip, Hawaii ended up having the worst bleaching that it's ever had, and they were unable to record any of it. And so Zach's idea, he was going to go and manually take pictures for 3 or 4 months and make his own time lapse and combine them all together. So every single day, he went out, same position at 60 different sites, and took pictures of basically of the coral. And every single day, obviously, got worse and worse, and you don't really realize it until the very end when he compiles all the time lapses together, and it shows how bad the bleaching actually is. And it was, just a very, very sad sight to see. And basically, by the end of 2016, when this documentary was created, 29% of the corals on the Great Barrier Reef died just in 2016. But, like I said earlier, with adaptation, there are ways to prevent this, and there's already countries. When this documentary was made in 2016, there were already multiple countries and cities that are converting to clean energy, trying to help stop not only our oceans and our corals, but all the ecosystems from the effects of global warming. But just one last thing I wanted to connect, just kind of like a little bit that happened during the documentary, was that it talked about symbiosis, which is another thing we learned in class, and it gave multiple examples. So one example is the anemone and the clownfish. So the clownfish provides food for the sea anemone, and the anemone provides protection for the clownfish by shocking anything that comes near it. And another thing is moray eels as well. Moray eels need the coral to hunt, to live, and multiple other animals. And watching this documentary, I kind of learned how much actually depends on our corals, and all living things in the ocean all kind of thrive and need the corals to survive. So if the coral dies and we don't, put, at least some sort of emphasis on stopping global warming more and more, then that could ultimately be like the end of all ocean life as we know it. And so, yeah, that's kind of my take on this documentary. Like I said, I loved the documentary. I think it started off a little bit slow, with getting to the point, but I thought them coming up with the technology to make the cameras and 3D printing separate parts, I thought that was really cool in the actual journey leading up to making the time lapse. And I thought it was cool how it showed Zach actually presenting his work. And another thing that I thought was cool was Zach got to meet his hero, a big marine biologist that he used to learn from when he was a kid. So, yeah. Overall, great documentary, and I'll definitely be recommending it to other people.